Greetings and welcome to The Black Room. This is the podcast for all things erotic mind control, and I am your host, Callidus, and it's good to be back with you after a little time off. Coming up in this episode, I'm going to talk about a little marvelous mind control that shows up in Captain America Civil War. Then I have some great news to share with you about a new blog from one of my favorite mind control authors, Tabico. I have a director's commentary on a new animation that I posted recently to my website. I'll talk a little bit about that and what went into it. And then in the bottom half of the show, I'm very happy to announce the first part of an interview with the prolific erotic mind control fiction author Jukebox, which was a lot of fun, a very good conversation, and one that you're definitely going to want to stick around for. So for my own part, I'm doing pretty well. I'm doing some commission work at the moment, which is keeping me busy and has turned into some really good writing exercise. Speaking of writing, I'm also working on a new animation. It's not out yet. I've completed all of the image work, all the animation work, but I'm writing a very lengthy story to go along with this new manip. And if you'd like a little preview of it, I did post some time ago. I think it was almost a year ago. Maybe July 2015, I did a blog post called Sketches to My Future Self, in which I talked about creating these rough sketches of manip ideas, animations, and things like that to keep in my work folder, so that as I slowly work through my backlog of material, I kind of remembered what the inspiration and the idea originally was. Well, the image that I showed in that blog post, along with my little sketch notes and the ideas I initially had, that's the piece that I'm working on right now. And it's called Cult, and I'm very, very pleased with how the animation has turned out, and I'm really enjoying the story too. It's a lot more in depth than anything I've done in a little while. I think it's a little bit more like Priestess, that manip I did with the hypnotic snake that's kind of set in a Conan the Barbarian-esque kind of fantasy universe, but it's a little bit like that, where it's a broader world. There's a little bit more mythology going on. It covers a broader period of time and stuff. It's really been fun to write, but I'm already over 2,000 words with it, so I'm not sure where it's going to land. But it's going to be much more of a picture with a short story than an animation with a caption. So hopefully you'll be up for reading something a little bit longer from me when that piece does come out, which I hope will be really soon. Possibly it might even be between this episode and the next episode of the show. Might be talking about it then, we'll see. So first off today, let's talk about marvelous mind control. Of course, if you listen to the show in the past, you know I'm a big fan of Marvel Studios, the Marvel television shows that they're doing, both on ABC as well as Netflix. And one of the things that's featured in a lot of Marvel's properties is mind control. It's a mainstay of the comics. As those of you who read comics will know, for many, many years, mind control is a device and theme that comes up many times. We've seen it in the Marvel films before, and I'm going to talk specifically about some interesting aspects of mind control in the latest entry in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Captain America Civil War. Now, before I get into that, let's go ahead and put out a spoiler warning. This is a recent film. It's been out a few weeks, but I am going to talk about major spoilers with the film. I'll speak very, very freely about it. So if you haven't seen it and you don't want to know anything, you want to go ahead and skip to the next section of the show, and you should be able to find that time in the description below. So, major spoilers coming for Captain America Civil War, and also some spoilers for Captain America Winter Soldier, the second film. So, having said that, in Captain America Civil War, mind control is kind of a central pillar in the film. That's not to say that it's wholly concerned with mind control the way that, say, Jessica Jones, the Netflix series, is, but the fact that mind control has occurred and the consequences of the mind control that has occurred are very, very important to not just the story of the film, but some very major drama with some characters in the film. In the second Captain America film, Winter Soldier, we found out that the identity of the Winter Soldier is in fact Bucky Barnes, Steve Rogers' best friend from when they were young together back during the World War II era, prior to Cap being frozen in ice and resurrected in the modern era. And in Winter Soldier, we find out that Bucky survived his fall that we see in the first Captain America film. He was captured and turned into the Winter Soldier, who is a mind-controlled drone that serves Hydra. Now, Hydra, the organization, also does a bit of mind controlling, which I've talked about on the show before, in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Season 2. The amazing brainwashing scene that takes place in that episode, Making Friends and Influencing People, is done by Hydra agents. So, in Civil War, the Winter Soldier is back, and as a consequence, so is the mind control. As a matter of fact, the very first scene of the film, we see this facility in Siberia, I believe, where the Winter Soldier is literally kept on ice. He's kept cryogenically frozen between his missions, and we see him being retrieved from this cryo storage unit, and we see his mind control programming being activated. And so the very first scene of the film is this list of 10 command words, which don't really seem to mean anything. They seem to kind of be nonsense. The 10 words are desire, rusted, 17, dawn, stove, 9, kind-hearted, homecoming, 1, freight car. And after those 10 words have been recited, we see Bucky as the Winter Soldier kind of go into this, it's this very subtle sort of shift, but he suddenly is kind of in drone mode, ready for his commands, and he responds to this by saying, ready to comply. And that is really, really interesting, because that is the same phrase that's used by Daniel Whitehall in the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. episode I mentioned. While he's brainwashing Agent 33, he is talking a lot about compliance, how compliance will be rewarded, that what you need to do is comply. And at one point, sort of during the real dramatic climax of the various brainwashing scenes that happen in that episode, but at the point where you, the audience, know, and Agent 33, she knows that they've got her, that she's not going to be able to resist this, Daniel Whitehall asks her, are you ready to comply? And so, of course, it makes sense that Hydra, utilizing this brainwashing technique against Agent 33, and of course the technique that they would have originally used to brainwash Bucky, of course it makes sense it's the same organization, that they would use some of the same phrases. But despite the fact that it makes sense, it's still very rewarding to see those threads being tied together between these different branches of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And there is another scene that happens later in the film, in Captain America Civil War, where Bucky is triggered against his will and still has no choice but to comply. And if you're a fan of handsome guys, which I understand that Sebastian Stan is a pretty handsome guy, I'm a terrible judge of male beauty myself, but I'm assured by people close to me that he's pretty hot. But if you're a fan of hot guys being mind controlled, that scene might have a little something for you. And then, of course, at the end of the film, we find out that what Bucky did after that first scene of the film, where we see him being pulled out of cryo and being programmed, the mission he goes on, that is the coup de grace in the bad guy's plans. Zemo, he's not he's Baron Zemo in the comics. He's not Baron Zemo in the film, but Zemo. That is the coup de grace in his scheme to destroy the Avengers from within. It is all based on Bucky's mind control and what Bucky did, which in this case he murdered Tony Stark's parents while he was mind controlled. And it's a pretty dramatic example. I think it's one of the more interesting uses of mind control in the Marvel films, insofar as the drama that comes out of it is really the centerpiece of that last act of the film. And it's a little bit closer to the mind control in Jessica Jones in the sense that the consequences of this person being mind controlled and what they did have far-reaching implications for, that central character as well as the characters around them. It changes their relationship with people in irrevocable ways, and there's a real weight to it, as opposed to the mind control in, let's say, the first Avengers film, where, and again, that film, mind control in the very first scene. Loki shows up on Earth. He uses the staff that he's been given by Thanos that has the mind control gem, the mind gem, and he immediately begins mind controlling the members of S.H.I.E.L.D. that are there, Stellan Skarsgård's character, Hawkeye. But I think that it's really, that mind control is really used more for a device. It's really more to kind of solve a problem and get the story moving. The mind control in Civil War, in Jessica Jones, and really in Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., as that second season goes on and we see more from Agent 33, those later examples of mind control really drive drama and become a real centerpiece of that character's kind of evolution through that story and future stories. So I really like Civil War, incidentally. It's a great film. I think it's probably my favorite movie that Marvel's put out so far. Definitely worth watching. And it'll be interesting to see if any of these trigger words might signify other things that we're going to see in future films. As many people have pointed out, one of the trigger words is Homecoming. And of course, the title of the next solo Spider-Man film is Spider-Man Homecoming. Now, I've seen people on the internet claim that the writers are saying that it was a complete accident, that the word homecoming ended up. It wasn't even intended to be sort of a tip of the hat to Spider-Man Homecoming. It was just an accident. I've not read the writer say that. I don't know if that's true, but that's what I've seen some people claiming. But even if we can chalk that up to being a mere accident, what probably isn't an accident is the fact that the three numbers that are in those 10 command words, 1, 9, and 17, probably correspond to Bucky's birth date, which Bucky was born in 1917, as we know in Captain America 2, when Steve is at the Smithsonian, and there's a bit of signage that's talking about Bucky as a member of the Howling Commandos, and it says he was born in 1917. It's also interesting that in Captain America, the First Avenger, right before Bucky supposedly dies in that film, he falls out of a freight car. So perhaps these things are meant to have some significance. Perhaps not. Perhaps they are just nonsense words, but it will be interesting to see in future installments to films in the MCU if some of these command phrases end up becoming not so insignificant once we have a little bit more context. And the way that Civil War ends, Bucky has not been deprogrammed. That's still very much a danger, which is a point that's really driven home by that first tag scene. So that being the case, Bucky's mind control not having been resolved, we probably have not seen the last of the marvelous mind control segment here on the Black Room Podcast, which suits me just fine because it gives me a chance to talk about two of my favorite things. Another one of my favorite things is your friend and mine, Tabico. Terrific author, terrific person, and now add to that list, blogger. Yes, you heard right. Tabico has launched her own blog, and its title is Tabico Secret Files. You can find her blog at Tabico SF, as in secret files, tabicosf.blogspot.com. And I'm delighted about this, number one, because Tabs is a friend of mine, and I think it's awesome that she's started up her own blog, but it's something she's talked about doing in the past, and so I'm very happy that she's taken that step and made it real. Now, for those of you who are interested in knowing a little bit more, and I figure that there's more than a few of you, I did a little Q&A with Tabico yesterday through email and just asked her a few questions about the blog that I thought you might want to hear the answers to. So, here we go. Question number 1. What made you decide to start a blog? And she says, I've wanted to have a blog for, years now. The challenge has been that I have 2 competing criteria when it comes to my own blog. I want control over the content, and I want to retain what I consider to be a comfortable level of anonymity. My fear on the first part is that the blog provider will assume that they own my words because I publish them on their platform. My fear on the second is that the provider company will be hacked and any personally identifying information will be out there for people to comb through. So what's changed is that Thrall's blog presence has been around long enough that I was able to satisfy myself on both of those counts. Her perspective on having a smut blog is similar enough to mine that her having done so for several years now has assuaged my fears and is why I picked Blogspot out of the various options for free blog hosting. Basically, I used a vicarious track record. This is also why I have not started a Patreon. Mark my words, Patreon will get hacked. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when, and credit card numbers and true names shall be revealed. Thus, were I to accept money via Patreon, I would want to do so using a shell corporation, 2 actually, one holding the other, and the cost of setting them up would pretty much eat any donations I would get. I like the Patreon model and am pleased it exists, but anonymity and money do not go together. Question 2. What is the import of the blog title, Tabico Secret Files? Answer. The explanation for that is discussed in the second post on the blog, but for the benefit of your listeners, from time to time I am asked if there are any more of my stories available other than those on the Mind Control Story Archive, and the answer is not really, but in fact there are a few. And I like hidden treasure, both discovering it myself and putting it out there for others to find. So my intent is to make some of these few otherwise vanished stories available at the blog as a sort of not-so-secret secret that more dedicated fans could find. Hence, secret files. Not that the stories are there yet, I need to figure out how to put up linked blog pages first, and some popular demand would not hurt my motivation, just saying. Also, as an author, I love cool phrases, and Tabico Secret Files just sounds cool. Question 3. What sorts of posts are you sharing with your readers? Answer. I could say whatever I feel like, but that's an answer which doesn't provide any value, so let me list some things. 1. Writing updates. I'll post if I've gotten something done, and sometimes when I haven't, because people might be interested. 2. Story ideas. I throw off story ideas like a worn bearing in a dynamo throws off sparks, and generally I don't do anything with those ideas and forget about them in a month. So I aim to leverage the blog to capture those ideas for others to appreciate and possibly for me to come back to and write. 3. Neat stuff. I surf for mind control content pretty much constantly and sometimes cool things turn up, so I'll post about them. Question 4. What's Tuesday Tabinings all about? Answer. I took a writing workshop a decade ago at which a well-known author gave a talk and he said something that all people, and particularly all writers, should take to heart. Quote, writing is hard and I am lazy, but I have a powerful ally and his name is habit. End quote. If you want to accomplish anything, one of the best ways to go about it is to correctly configure your habits. Discard the bad ones, create and adhere to the good ones. Obviously, this is easier said than done, but it remains true. If, let's say, you put the kids to bed and write for an hour because that's what you do, it becomes a lot easier to get a story written than if you put the kids to bed and then think, do I feel like writing? That way lies television, video games, and an ocean of unwritten words. So, as regards the blog and Tabinings, I'm trying to create the habit of posting about my current smut output regularly every Tuesday. Ideally, this will also help spur me to write so that I'll have something to boast about, but worst case, it will keep the blog from fizzling out after a month. And it's a lame portmanteau of Tabico happenings, but I like lame portmanteaus. Question 5. Any chance we'll see your gallery of existing or future image manips make an appearance? Answer. Unlikely. I haven't been doing manips for quite a while. I like them and consume them avidly, but I haven't made any myself in some time. That said, I have made several, mostly failed, forays into render work, and it is highly likely that you will see the results of my next foray into Daz/Poser on the blog, probably this summer. I say failed because each time I've tried, the user interface for Poser has broken my will to learn. It's so incredibly non-intuitive that I just give up rather than try to face learning one more thing. But I want to be able to render my naughty pictures, so I keep coming back. And there you have it, straight from the author's mouth. Well, I guess actually it's not, since it's my mouth. Let's not get bogged down in whose mouth got used for what, is the point I am making here. And the other point is that you should really check out Tabico's blog at tabicosf.blogspot.com, because it's a fascinating look inside the mind and the process of a really terrific author, and her blog posts are filled with funny tidbits and naughty tidbits and really interesting insight into her craft and how she works and approaches writing and stories. I've read all of them thus far. They're each a fantastic read. It's definitely a site you're going to want to add to your bookmarks and your RSS reader. All right, let me talk a little bit about the latest animation that I posted to my website, which is called Worm. This actually has been up over a month now. It originally went up on April 11th. It's the first manip I've done in 2016, and it's one that I'm very, very pleased with how it turned out. It is an interesting sort of intersection of a lot of different things that I've been wanting to do and have finally made good on for myself. Now, the animation itself is an idea that has been rattling around for a while, and it's something where I've collected a lot of different images over the years that might have been able to work in this context. But essentially, what I'd wanted to do is I'd wanted to do some sort of mind control worm animation where you would see this large fleshy worm moving from the mouth of one woman into the mouth of another woman. And it very much calls to mind some of the squickier mind control fiction that I've read over on the archive, and that has really appealed to me over the years. So I really wanted to do something in that vein. And not too long ago, I guess it was maybe around January, I went through a folder of images that I'd had stashed and suddenly discovered this one image that I just thought was perfect. I really loved the composition. I liked the models involved, and I thought that it wouldn't take too much work to kind of accomplish what I wanted to, which, of course, famous last words. So I end up with this image that there's a woman laying down on a couch. There's another woman kneeling above her, and she's got her mouth open, her tongue extended, and she's licking the base of this large vibrator that she's pushing into the mouth of the woman lying down. And I loved all those combinations of the imagery. I love the fact that she had a hand on it. I love the fact that she had her tongue out. I thought that I could really use that as a way to kind of demonstrate her own action, that, you know, she's expelling this worm into this other woman, her friend, her roommate, as the story begins to kind of form in my mind as I'm looking at this. So I started working on the foundations of the image, and I had to change some things around. I had to move her arm. I had to take some things out, put some things in, just to kind of get the background the way that I wanted it. And then I started working on the animation. I actually animated the worm before I actually kind of had artwork for the worm. I just had this sort of placeholder shape that I was using, but I found that it was really kind of helpful to see how the worm was moving, or how it would be moving, which is in this relatively volatile fashion, before I actually nailed down what the actual look was going to be like. And it ended up looking a little bit more muscular than what I'd initially thought of. But it was a really, really fun project to put together, and I actually utilized the software that I've spoken about on the show before, Blackmagic Fusion. This really powerful piece of compositing and animation software that is available completely for free on Windows and Mac. I really wanted to use that since I haven't touched it in so long, but it was a favorite tool of mine many years ago. It's the tool that I use to create orientation, and I really wanted to get back into it, so I decided to use it for this manip, and it was a really, really fun way to go about getting back into it, because I did so much experimentation with this animation. Once I got the women and the background all kind of arranged the way I wanted, once I got the worm moving the way I wanted, and I began to settle on what the worm was going to look like in terms of that underlying sort of texture, the way that the skin looked, the way that you could sort of see some muscle fibers or things like that under the skin, just all those little details that I like to put in. Once all that was in place, I realized that there was a lot of opportunity for animation beyond that. And this is what I was talking about earlier when I was saying kind of the intersection of some ideas I've wanted to try before. Most of the animations I do only have one component that's moving. It's a still image other than maybe a hand with a swinging watch or a swinging jewel, or it's the image is still other than lights spinning in the room, or a spiral turning on a television screen or something like that. And with this animation, I really wanted to try animating a lot of different pieces within the image and see kind of how that would come off. So one of the first things I did is I animated this breathing effect with the woman who's lying down, the woman who is the victim of this mind control worm, as it's crawling into her body and beginning to take over her. So I animated this breathing effect, this sort of rapid. It could be panic breathing, it could be sex breathing, but she's breathing in this very fast rhythm. And once I finished with that, I kind of liked it, and I thought, I could do something with her cheeks, like the way that a woman giving oral sex, the way that the cheeks will suck in. And so I did a little bit of work and tried to sort of create this effect, like her cheeks distending around this worm as she's sucking it into her throat. And then that got me thinking about, well, the throat, and I could do something with that. And so I created this animation of her throat kind of bulging as this creature is moving into her body. And then I thought, well, I should do the same thing on the woman who's already been turned and is now regurgitating this worm. So I animated this movement with her throat as it's contracting and expanding as the worm is passing between them, and just all these little details that really excited me. It was really fun to just explore those different things, and each one of them is sort of kinky and wrong in delicious ways, things that, I don't know, it turned me on, and hopefully other people as well. And just little subtle things, like a little bit of saliva just sliding down her cheek as she's sucking on this worm, a little bit of saliva from her friend, the woman who's on top kneeling down, a little bit of saliva dripping down the side of the worm as these two women are connected by this squicky alien creature. So it was just a lot of fun all around, putting together all these different elements that I don't normally use, and of course utilizing this software, which I have such fond memories of and have used on some of my favorite projects from past years. And that was before I even got to the writing, and the writing was very, very fun as well. I started out by doing something I don't often do, which is to essentially write a short story. I sat down and wrote for several hours and came up with something that was over 2,000 words long. And if I'm honest, borrowed liberally from Tabico's subroutine in terms of its pacing and its structure. And in the interest of distinguishing itself from that, making a little bit more of its own thing, but also to get it down to something I thought was a more readable size, I trimmed it by way of compressing time and moving the story from something that takes place over the course of maybe a week or two to a single evening. And so what I end up with in the story is Crystal, the protagonist, is at home when her roommate, Eve, comes through the door, early, home from work, and looking a little green. And Eve doesn't really say anything, she just beelines into her room. And over the course of the evening, Crystal's hearing these whimpering and groaning sounds coming from Eve's room and thinking that Eve must be in there and quite ill. So when the door finally opens and Eve emerges, Crystal is all ready to provide comfort and ask how she's feeling. And what she doesn't expect is for Eve to come out sort of glassy-eyed with this glossy sheen on her body, looking very, very green. Not sick green, but some other kind of green. And Crystal notices this smell in the air that immediately makes her salivate for something she can almost kind of taste, something familiar, but she can't quite place what it is that she's hungry for. And Eve comes closer to her and closer to her and backs her to the couch, and Crystal falls backwards onto the couch, and Eve climbs on. And at first, Crystal thinks that she's being seduced by her roommate, and she's not entirely against that idea. And she sees Eve's throat kind of trembling, and she interprets it as nervousness, that Eve's doing something that she's not quite sure of. And then she opens her mouth, and the worm emerges. And in this kind of the B-plot storytelling of the caption, I season it with all these details about Eve working in some sort of secretive lab somewhere, and try to create just enough of a plausible explanation for where Eve might have been that she would come into contact with an alien mind control worm. So the kind of the takeover, the worm invading Crystal's body, taking over her mind, turning her into host form like her roommate Eve. The text really kind of covers that part of what you see in the image. And then, as I like to do, I love to lead out with a suggestion of where things are going next, of a story that's going to continue past the moment that we see in the animation. And there's a strong intelligence to this worm. It has a plan, and it's using Eve and now Crystal by the end of the story to execute that plan. And its first action is to use Eve to grow a decoy, a duplicate of itself, that she's going to take back to the lab and put in place of the worm that somehow lured her in, snared her, and used her to escape. And the master worm is going to stay at home in the apartment and use Crystal to start growing slaving slugs, these smaller worms that are going to be useful very soon, because Eve's research on the worm presumably is suddenly going to encounter a breakthrough, and she's going to need a team of people around her to help study this new information that she's going to come into. And so the master wants to make sure that they are ready to take control of that team, and then can only imagine where the plot goes from there. But I love to just do that kind of economic storytelling right at the end, and just throw the ball a little bit downfield and get the audience's imagination thinking about what might come next. That is one of the aspects that I find really fun in creating these animations and the stories that go along with them. Go check out this manip. It's called Worm. It's on my website. It's the top image right now from 2016. The first, but definitely not the last, squicky image that I will be uploading this year, as the next one is quite squicky as well. And stay on the lookout for that. All right, so with that out of the way, it is now time, I'm delighted to inform you, to dive into the first part of my interview with Jukebox. And I really had a lot of fun interviewing him. Jukebox is a prolific author. He's got a lot of stories, and he's a very talented writer. For the amount of volume that he puts out, I find all of his stories so interesting and imaginative and unique, and there's not any other author that I can think of that is quite like Jukebox. And I really relish the opportunity to finally speak with him. He and I are kind of connected by a few different common friends, sort of in these overlapping circles. And so he was somebody that I always imagined I would have a really enjoyable time talking to, and that was certainly the case. It also doesn't hurt that his hypnodom and friend, Lady Ruetha, makes a surprise appearance. And if you know anything about Jukebox and Lady Ruetha, you know that Jukebox is an absolute trance slut for Lady Ruetha, as he himself will inform you of at some point in the interview. But that was a very nice surprise. And Lady Ruetha she's very fun to talk to, very charming lady. And as a matter of fact, years ago, when I was first kind of getting on my feet doing my own website, Lady Ruetha gave me a very nice plug on her podcast, The Realm of Bliss. Said some very, very complimentary things about me and my work, and I always remember that. Very, very kind words from a very, very classy hypnodom. So enjoy this first part of my interview with Jukebox and be on the lookout for a surprise appearance from Lady R. My guest on the Black Room this week is one of the most prolific authors in all of EMCdom, and certainly someone who has touched on a lot of different genres, a lot of different styles of mind control fiction. He is, of course, known for his clever inclusion and use of song titles in his story titles, and always has a way of making mind control fun and dramatic and scorching hot. Please welcome to the Black Room, Jukebox.
Hi, thank you for having me.
You are very welcome. I'm delighted to finally have you on the show, and I also have to mention a mutual friend of ours, which is Thrall, A. Regine and Callidus, who when I was first putting the show together and she was helping me brainstorm ideas for potential guests, and your name was right at the top of the list.
She is a wonderful person and a great author, so I'm...
Yes, on both counts.
Yeah.
Let's, as I like to do when I do interviews, let's start at the beginning. When did you know that you had a fetish for erotic mind control?
It would have been pretty early on. I mean, certainly the Sword of Shannara had an early scene in there that had some mind control that I remember at a very young age as being interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, the usual suspects, Sarah Jane Smith in Doctor Who.
Yes. It's so funny you say that, because I mean, literally 10 minutes before we got on Skype, I was digging through some stuff and I came across an animated GIF set I did of a Sarah Jane hypno scene from Doctor Who that I'd posted to Tumblr, and I was, I need to post this to my website. It's so funny that would come up.
Yeah, well, Liz Sladen, she always had the greatest hypnotized look.
She did. I mean, like, really, she has kind of set the bar by which all others are measured moving forward.
Yeah. X-Men comics, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Chris Claremont, I frequently joke that he, reads my stuff, and it's too shy to admit it.
Yeah. Have you seen the Chris Claremont mind control blog?
I have not seen it. I've seen some posts passed around Tumblr where people just, start piling on all of the things that he did, Spiral's Body Shop,
oh yeah,
the Hounds, the Hellfire Club, Worm.
It's Legion, yeah. But there is an entire blog that's dedicated to nothing but instances of mind control in Chris Claremont written comics, and I'll get you the link. It's fascinating. I mean, it's a fascinating read to look through this, and I mean, this guy's got to be one of us. He's got to be.
And now that I say it, I said X-Men comics, but really for me, one of the big ones was an old issue of Marvel Team Up where Kraven captured Tigra, put a mind control collar on her, and used her to attack Spider-Man. And even at 9 or 10, I was thinking that was a real waste of a mind-controlled cat.
Far-reaching mind at work there, yeah.
You just picture all of the other supervillains meeting up with him in the bar after that caper failed, going, wait, go back a bit.
You did what with Tigra?
So wait, you had Tigra mind-controlled, and you did what now?
Yep.
And then they all just laugh at him.
Yeah, Kingpin especially. Kingpin laughed, and he laughed really, really hard.
Yeah. And then when I got into being a teenager, Jack Chalker.
I'm not familiar with that.
Jack Chalker he is passed on now, unfortunately, but he was one of the first science fiction authors I read who used sex in his stories, but was writing stories. And it really kind of opened my eyes to the fact that you didn't necessarily have to have a firm line between smut and real writing.
In quotes, yeah.
Yeah. He had characters who thought about sex. The villain of this piece, had the ability to resculpt reality, and one of the first things he did was he resculpted himself a body capable of indefinite numbers of orgasms, because really, why wouldn't you?
Yes. If you're going to go down the list of things to do with your omniscient powers or your omnipotent powers, that's going to be towards the top.
Yeah, and you know, I mean, it wasn't done for purely prurient reasons. It was just part of the story, but it made sense. And then George R. R. Martin's Wild Card series.
I've heard that. I've had that recommended, but I'm not. Obviously, I'm familiar with you know, as most of us are familiar with Martin through you know, through the Song of Ice and Fire
Game of Thrones
books that are the basis for Game of Thrones. But I've had that series recommended to me by a vanilla friend, like someone who doesn't know that I'm into mind control. But I happen to know that series has some mind control in it.
It has mind control, and it also has a lot of sex that is not mind control and is just, you know, presented as adult people doing the things that grown-ups do. It was, you know, it was a real awakening to me that, yeah, you can have this stuff and it's still okay to write decently.
So are we talking already, are we already kind of getting into some of your influences as an author yourself? Because obviously the reason you're here is that out of everybody on the Mind Control archive, I can't think of anyone whose page looks the way that yours does. Number one, how many stories? Do you know the number of stories that you have on the archive right now?
I am currently working on my 300th story.
So 300
minus
is about to go up.
No, it's not about to go up. It's about to get finished. Minus about 13 or 14. So I figure about 285, 290, somewhere in that range.
Okay, so closing in on 300 stories. I look through, like, just looking through the colors that would denote the styles of mind control, the types, the pairings of men and women and that kind of thing. I see purple, gold, green, pink, yellow, pink, green. You have an amazing diversity in your work. You write stories that are really dramatic and filled with tension and anxiety. You write stories that are very lighthearted and fun. You write stories that are just pure heat, just pure scorching erotic heat. I would imagine that you have an equally sort of diverse range of influences, and certainly you've talked about some fantasy and sci-fi authors, but are we talking about, are these things kind of influencing this amazing body of work that you have, or are we already kind of into that at this point?
Oh, certainly, yeah. I mean, Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett are both huge influences too. They never did much MC work, but I really do consider Terry Pratchett to have been one of the finest writers ever that I've ever had the privilege to read. And, this is coming from someone with a classical education. I've read Dickens, I've read, Yeah.
You've read the greats, in quotes.
Yeah, and Terry Pratchett really is up there with them. Stephen King has been a big influence. I had this huge King jag right up until Gerald's Game. I got 10 pages into Gerald's Game, and I bounced so hard, I don't think I picked up another Stephen King book for a decade.
and how long ago has that been since this occurred?
Gerald's Game had just recently come out at that point. This is like 90, 91, somewhere in there.
Okay. And so what eventually brought you back to the fold? Because King is an interesting author, and not just for the obvious reasons.
I think what brought me back to the fold was his nonfiction book he did on writing. That was what triggered me getting back towards him. And I haven't caught up with everything. I'm not as conversant with King as I would have been, when Gerald's Game came out, where it was I had read everything. But I pick up his stuff on a regular basis, and he's a fabulous writer of short stories. His novels are good, but his short stories, he is really a master of the craft of writing.
I could not have said that better myself. And I feel exactly the same way. Because it's interesting, that was where I was going to lead you, is into that, because I'm an enormous fan of Stephen King's short stories, but I've not made it through very many of his novels.
His novels are kind of a thing of pieces, I believe. He'll have very good... They almost feel like several short stories collected together into an overarching narrative, and some of them are very good and some of them less so. But, it feels like lots of linked short stories. He'll just diverge into a smaller piece.
The first Stephen King stuff that I read was I want to say I can't remember which collection it was, Graveyard Shift I want to say, and I was really in awe, and from what I understand, that period of his work is when he's pretty young, early in his college career I want to say.
Yeah, and probably drinking pretty heavily at that.
Yes, as he was wont to do. For many years.
Although, actually, I mean, there's a very good MC story in that collection. It's Night Shift, and there's one called...
Yes, Night Shift, that's it.
Yeah, I Know What You Like, which was another example, way of processing that there can be other ways of telling these stories, where it's just this woman she's not actually being controlled, but this guy knows everything about her due to this magic, and he can always give her exactly what she's looking for at any moment.
Manipulation, if not out-and-out mental control.
Yeah.
Well, Thrall and I have talked about, and I can't remember if we went into it when she was on the show, but Thrall and I have talked quite a bit about The Raft. And that was a story that both she and I noticed, earlier in our lives when, a lot of this stuff was still kind of forming. And, The Raft has... not exactly mind control, but mesmerization.
Yeah, the oil slick effect.
Yes, and the thing about King is that he is amazing at concepts. He is amazing at just coming up with some sort of hook, some sort of concept for whatever the story is going to be, that is instantly kind of compelling and interesting. And, if you're recounting a Stephen King short to somebody, it's pretty easy to hook them at the beginning and just tell them the entire story because they're so compelling. And it in addition to the fact that he's an amazing writer of characters, his characterizations are really profoundly good. And he has utilized mind control a few times. There's a film that's based on... it doesn't appear in the short story, but the film for Maximum Overdrive, it uses a little bit of like the Raft's mesmerization. There's a scene where a guy is kind of hypnotized by an early arcade game, like an arcade game machine, and it sort of just stuns him, with this flashing light pattern long enough to kill him somehow. I can't remember how it actually goes down, but a very similar idea to The Raft.
Yeah, I'll admit I never saw the movie of that.
Oh, I'm so jealous of you. I'm so jealous. I wish I could make it to the end of my life and say I never watched Maximum Overdrive.
Another couple of authors I should mention, Harlan Ellison.
Right.
Again, just a masterpiece of economy. It is harder to tell a story briefly than it is to tell it with length.
Yeah.
And Ellison was always just a master at conveying things with a very few words that had a lot of depth to them. And also Alan Moore, who I know he didn't work much in the medium of prose, but
a profound writer.
Yeah, he was a profound influence.
Have you read his Neonomicon comic series, the graphic novel?
I have not. No.
It's worth your time.
Yeah, I'll admit I have gotten away from comics for a while. I'm getting back to them very slowly and gradually, and some of that will probably involve picking up, back stuff of Moore's. But
yeah, you can never go wrong there.
Yeah. But then, the other thing I always tell people, the biggest influence I have is nonfiction.
That's interesting. Talk a little bit about that. Can you give me a specific example of a nonfiction work that's really inspired you, or is really kind of apparent in your own work?
Well, I don't know that there's any. I mean, I can think of some very good nonfiction works that I would recommend. There's a lot of good potpourri books, pop history and pop science, things like There's a book called Elephants on Acid, which is nothing but a list of strange and unusual scientific experiments that have been carried out over the years.
That and a really great title.
It is a really great title. They did, in fact, dose an elephant with LSD to see what would happen.
And they're lucky they lived to tell the tale.
Well, unfortunately, the elephant didn't. They don't know what happened, but it did pass. Yeah, but a lot of the stuff in there about psychology, like if you read a recent story of mine, X, Y, and Z.
Mm-hmm. I did.
That one is based on some of the psychology experiments in there. Milgram's obedience to authority experiments, which, are real and of questionable methodology and probably had plenty of made-up results because,
Yes, well, everything about that study is pretty controversial. Which, if people don't know what you're talking about, the study you're referring to is pretty famous. Almost everybody's heard of it, even if they don't know the particulars. But it's the scientific study that was in which the subjects were brought in and they were directed by an authority figure, I believe a doctor or something. They were operating this control panel that was going to be administering electrical shocks to a person who was in an adjacent room that they could hear, but I don't believe they could see them. And the person, they're increasingly delivering more and more voltage, and the authority figure is directing them to up the voltage and keep shocking them, and the person in the next room is pleading and begging for it to stop and crying out in pain. And the point of the experiment is that in the presence of an authority figure, people did something really, really bad. I mean, they essentially tortured another human being, something that they professed to have not wanted to do, and yet they did anyway at the direction of someone else.
Yeah. And, that wound up becoming the basis for this story. And I mean, it's more than just that. I mean, you pick up little details. It's not necessarily the big overarching strokes, but it's things that you notice and remember. As I've said on occasion, if you read someone's work of fiction and you steal every good idea in it and cannibalize it and, use direct quotes from it and everything, that's plagiarism. You get in terrible trouble for that sort of thing. If you read someone's work of nonfiction and you steal every good idea in it, that's research and people commend you on it.
Right. That's so true. When did you discover the online erotic mind control community? When did you put the words erotic mind control to what you were feeling, watching some of these television shows, reading some of these books?
I hesitate to admit how long ago it was here, but then again, you and
I are probably about the same age.
Yeah, so and my first story appeared in 1999, so obviously there's a limit to how much I can hide this.
Right.
But the first time I remember was reading some of the stuff RC was putting on there. Mm-hmm. And I had seen other stories before that featured mind control as an element, but RC's was the first story where the induction was the erotica.
Yes.
It ended pretty much once the characters got naked. And when I saw that story was really hot, I realized, no, this is what I'm actually interested in.
Yep.
And it was not long after that Simon started the EMCSA and posted to, alt-sex stories that he would be, kind of
posting this archive.
Yeah, curating selections from it and looking for submissions and things.
And the rest, as they say, is history.
Oh no, that was actually like a good 2 years before I started writing for it.
Well, RC is all, like the first erotic mind control story I ever read was RC. So certainly, that's a very large, that's a figure that casts a long shadow in our little corner of the web.
Yeah, RC and Deirdre, I remember, or Deirdre.
Yeah, I'm not sure how it was pronounced, but I know the author you're talking about, though.
Yeah, I remember her stuff being very popular in those early.
Deidre, perhaps, I don't know. Obviously, the conversation I was having with Madame Keistelot and certainly, talking with Thrall, but a name that often comes up is Trilby Else. Is Trilby Else anywhere in your orbit?
Well, we've corresponded on occasion. He's very private, so
Yeah, that's one way of putting it.
I certainly have not, not gotten to talk with him as much as I would like, but
I feel the same way.
But yes, we've corresponded, and obviously he's a huge influence on me. Anytime I go really dark in a story, I am channeling my inner Trilby.
Yep, same here.
I think the story I did, Borderline, was my attempt to try to distill everything he'd ever written down to under 2,000 words.
It's an interesting point you make, and something that I want to ask you about. I mean, one of the things about you that is so interesting is how reliable you are with with your releases. I mean, you really do. I mean, obviously, there's been periods of time where you've not you've not been posting every week, but more often than not, you have something new just about every single week. But your stuff does tend to be short. It tends to be. I mean, I don't know. I don't mean that as a detrimental statement. It's just you tend to write short stories. Was that a conscious thing when you started out? Were you determined to kind of limit yourself a little bit for the for the creative adversity that would create as far as managing the length of the story, or just distilling your ideas down to a pure form?
I think it started as, when I started, it was really what I could write. I wanted to have something I could write in one session of sitting down. Mm-hmm. And I can write about 1,000 words an hour. So, that's a typical story for me is somewhere between 2 and 5 hours in front of the keyboard. And I try to keep my ideas down to something manageable for that. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think some of it is that I have a hard time coming up with something that's multi-part, because I always feel like I am going to lose the thread of it somewhere. If I write something and I post part 1, I feel an enormous sense of worry that I will not get to part 2.
Interesting. I had no idea that would be a factor for you. Just given it seems very ironic, just given how reliable you are in your releases, but the idea of like kind of carrying a story through multiple parts, I would never have imagined that was sort of something that was a little intimidating to you. Yeah,
if you'll notice, I only did it once, and also if you'll notice, there was a 5 or 6 year gap between part 2 and part 3. It's made me a little gun shy, which actually, right. That was the funny thing about collaborating with Thrall was, she posts these long multi-part epics, and I am there going, I can't do that. Yeah. And we wound up compromising by working out 3 interlinked stories, any of which could be read on their own, but which made more sense when read back to back to back.
Certainly, yeah, and very, very good. What do you? I've always called them the Whiter Shade of Pale, series. But what did you guys? What's the official name of that trilogy?
We call it the White Album.
The White Album, yeah. So the White Album stories are really fantastic. They're full of really great characters. There's fun moments. There's there's hot moments. There's tragic moments. But there's a lot of fun to be had in those 3 stories. I always recommend those to people who have not already read them.
We definitely had a lot of fun writing them. It was an experience. I think that neither one of us were entirely sure we could make our writing styles mesh. We were both very, I think, worried about that. But it wound up being a lot of fun collaborating, and I think. It felt very organic. I don't know if she talked to you about how we wrote, how the process actually worked.
Just a little bit, but I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, we actually had a Google document open, a shared Google document open, and we would talk to each other on the phone and trade off paragraph. Well, not literally every paragraph, but we would trade off chunks. And so when one of us got to a point where you're like, I'm out of good words here, I'm just going to tag you in and let you do the words for a while.
That's fascinating. So, like a very kind of real-time collaboration then.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we were talking about where are we going to go with this, what do you think is going to be the next scene? Does this make sense to you? Does this look plausible? Is this going to cause problems further down the road?
Mm-hmm.
And, but at the same time, we were actually just literally writing in the same document at the same time, which I think is one of the most organic forms of collaboration I've ever done. And I've done the same thing with Lady Ruetha. We have some collaborations as well that are written in that same fashion.
Yeah, what's the... I'm looking for it here, and I'm not going to remember the title of it, but what's the story? Didn't you guys collaborate, you and Lady Ruetha, collaborate on a story, and it's done as a series of forum posts made by various characters leading up to a con that they're going to be attending, where mind control naughtiness is going to be going down.
Yep, it's called I Can't Wait.
I Can't Wait. I absolutely love that story. It's absolutely fantastic. If you in the audience have not read this story, it is so worth your time. And I love the form. I don't know what the device is called where literature is concerned. Whereas opposed to reading prose, you are reading documents. The way that Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, where it's a series of letters or newspaper clippings or that type of thing. But you're getting the story. In this case, forum posts, but it's a brilliant use of that literary device.
It's called the epistolary. My senior paper was on Gothic novels, so something I wrote.
So you're well versed.
Yeah, that was actually a really weird and awkward conversation in class because I had read Stephen King's Danse Macabre, where he has large sections covering most of the major Gothic novels, Jekyll and Hyde, Dracula, Frankenstein, and so when we're going into the class and we're talking about Dracula, and I'm saying, it was when we were talking about Frankenstein, and I was like, well, everyone caught the implication that the monster raped Elizabeth before he killed her, and everyone's looking at me like, you are fucking creepy. I'm like, no, it's there, it's in the book.
It's in the story.
Textually supported that I'm just gonna hide now.
So I guess that leads very naturally into my next question, which is, were you already writing before you began writing erotic fiction, or was the erotic mind control stuff the thing that kind of got you writing?
I was already writing. I obviously don't want to get too far into it, but I do have some vanilla publishing credits. I think that I had finished writing something that got into print just before, like, a few months before I started writing my first EMCSA story. And then there was during the stretch after I stopped, my first hiatus, I did more vanilla writing then. And then got back into the EMC writing.
I would imagine, just given the talent of some of the people who we've seen on the Erotic Mind Control Story Archive over the years, I would be very, very surprised if many of them don't have some published credits, because in some cases, I mean, they're too good at writing to have not to have not done some of it, quote unquote, professionally.
Oh yeah, I mean, a lot of science fiction fantasy authors write erotica under one pen name or another. Obviously,
Certainly.
Anne Rice is the famous example, but I know that Virgin Publishing, for example, had a line of erotica in addition to their line of Doctor Who books back in the 90s. And, having made acquaintances with some of those authors, I know there was some crossover, although I probably shouldn't name names.
No, that would probably not be wise. But that's an excellent morsel of a tease there.
I will say that if you read those erotica novels, you will notice more than a few cheeky, deliberate Doctor Who references inserted in there just because they knew that nobody at Virgin actually really cared about the quality of the plots, and so they would stick jokes in there. Like really obscure in-jokes, like one of the novels was named The Velvet Web, which is the title of a 60s black and white Doctor Who episode. That kind of obscure fan reference.
Right. And this is is this during the period of time in the 90s where this is post the terrible attempt to reboot Doctor Who in the States, when the Doctor is being at least retrospectively the Doctor is Paul McGann.
This right before that. Okay. Immediately after the series went off the air, Virgin said, look, we've been asking for years if we could do original novels, and you've always said no because the TV show's on the air. It's about...
Now it's not.
Yeah. And they ran that for a good 6 or 7 years, and then the TV movie came out, and the BBC novelized the TV movie, and Virgin said, hey, that's a violation of our contract. And the BBC said, funny about that, your rights are coming up, and boy, we just don't really feel like renewing them. They lost the license, and then BBC pulled it all in-house, which is where it still is to this day. I'm sorry. I could probably geek out about Doctor Who for hours.
No, we can do another episode. I mean, we can come back and we can do a whole other episode on Doctor Who because I'm a big Doctor Who fan, and have been since I was very, very young. It's one of those formative shows that introduced me to a lot of science fiction and certainly erotic mind control. I've said before that some of my earliest memories of, and just awareness of media and things like that, I can remember mind control and a certain fascination with it. And Doctor Who is, one of the, it's one of the inner planets orbiting that star.
Yeah. Also Saturday morning cartoons were pretty...
Oh, yeah.
But.
Well, you got the Saturday morning cartoons and you've got the live action adventure shows.
Yeah.
And I don't know what it was that was in the water back in the 70s. Actually, I have a pretty good idea of what was in the water back in the 70s, but it's really interesting to look back at how popular mind control was as a device across so many different kinds of media aimed at so many different audiences.
Well, I mean, let me put it this way. I've never really thought that it was as accidental as all that. I mean, certainly when you read, like, William Moulton Marston's biographies, he was very explicitly using mind control as a sort of gateway to S&M. Mm-hmm. It was his full intent that he would raise a generation of guys who thought that being tied up and doing whatever women said was awesome because he thought the world would be a better place if women were in charge of it. And
he was just fulfilling that agenda.
Yeah, Wonder Woman is, the bondage themes and the lesbian themes and the DS themes, they are not there by accident. The man...
Oh, no. He had a very colorful home life.
Yeah, he was poly. His wife and his lover were both bi, and as far as I know, they think they stayed together for quite a while after his death.
My understanding is, that they had a very stable poly relationship.
Yeah.
He managed to have, a very prosperous professional career despite having a very different lifestyle for that period of time.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of mind control elements are, were included in that sort of way, is you can't have a scene where the villainess literally seduces the hero, but you can have a scene where she, puts him in front of a hypnosis spiral,
Right.
These things are basically talking about sex in an environment where censorship was rife, and so they're coded sexuality. And I think that's part of why, we wind up with the fetish is we're picking up on that code.
Do you think that hypnotism is inherently sexual on some level? I mean, like, and I'm thinking about, like, even going, like the early, the kind of the animal magnetism era and all that. Is there something inherently sexual about hypnosis?
I don't necessarily think inherently sexual, but certainly, I mean, it forms a very close emotional bond, and if someone is, if there is an attraction, it will, I think, it will facilitate that.
Certainly. It's a very intimate practice, no matter, to what end it's employed. I don't have any objectivity where this is concerned, but I'm fascinated by the origins of our fetish, because it is simultaneously to me, and I think a lot about what Winter Rose has written about the origins of erotic mind control, and he takes it back to like the Greek epics and love potions and Shakespeare and things like that.
Well, actually, I was going to say I have a story, Hysteria, which is very much designed to be evoking Mesmer, and not just Mesmer, but the entire... This is another example of how reading nonfiction really helps you, because Stephen King talked about in Danse Macabre how Mesmer and mesmerism were really very, obviously sex for a generation of people that wouldn't recognize sex when it bit them because they were so culturally repressed.
Yes.
I mean, back then, and this features into the story, an orgasm was considered pretty much to be a medical treatment for women's nervous
hysteria.
Disorder. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen, I don't know if advertisement's the right word, but I've seen, things from the 19th century, talking about these fantastic inventions to help women with hysteria. It's like, wow, this looks remarkably like a vibrator.
And they knew what it was, and they knew they were giving these women orgasms, but, that was considered to be just a medical treatment to keep these women from getting too flustered. The idea that they would do it purely for pleasure, no, that was absurd.
No, it was in pursuit of, of some greater cause.
Stable temperament, that kind of thing. And so, that's what that particular...
For the betterment of society, we have to give these women orgasms.
Yeah, and that's what that particular story is a woman going in to, get hypnotized and basically fingered as a medical treatment.
Yep. I want to talk about, this is something that I've talked about with Madame Kistelot quite a bit, because she shares my fondness for the history of things, and obviously this is something that you're very well versed in and well studied in. Where do you think it happens? Where's the first time that you can kind of reach back into the history of the 20th century and say that where mind control becomes erotic mind control, where it's not used as a kind of wink wink nudge nudge euphemism for seduction and actual sex, but where it is explicitly used for seduction and sex?
Honestly, the first thing that pops to mind, and it may, this is, I have not studied this, but I would say Barbarella. That is a pretty explicit sequence where she is locked in...
the excessive machine.
Yeah. The orgasm.
Yeah, it certainly looms large in my mind, as well as many others, I'm sure. Thank God for the 60s. It birthed so many great sequences like that, and of course, our man Flint is one that I often point to. That is, they are literally brainwashing women to become pleasure units. I don't know if I can think of another sort of more direct and earlier direct representation that kind of has all the pieces of our fetish. I mean, it's got conspiracy, it's got brainwashing chambers, it's got beautiful women. I mean, there's stories in the Erotic Mind Control archive that exist only because somebody made Our Man Flint.
Yeah, and I'm sure that if I were more familiar with, pulp literature, I'm sure I would find stuff. I mean, for one thing, you see all those covers that are just like blatantly.
Oh, they're fantastic.
Yeah, and I'm sure that there is plenty of it in there too, but
Yeah, and I'm the same way. Like I actually, my long-term goal is to read a lot more pulp fiction of that era, because I agree with you. I feel like almost certainly like the origins of a lot of that stuff is in there in I'm guessing like the 40s.
Yeah, I mean, this again, it's one of those things where I am not one of the people who really goes looking for the historical material and stuff. I know that there are people who just collect clips and things that, of hypnosis in media. I've never been one of them.
Guilty.
Yeah, and God bless you for it, but it's never been my particular part of it. Is I don't go looking for old clips and old covers and things. If I find them, that's fascinating. But like the scene we were just talking about with the Orgasmatron, I'm more familiar with it than have seen it.
And I believe that we will leave it there for this week. I want to profoundly thank my guest Jukebox, who I had a wonderful time talking to. And I promise you that if you tune in next time for the second and final part of this interview, you're definitely going to see a surprise appearance from Lady Ruatha. And if you'd like to check out Jukebox's work more, in the interim, you can find him at Jukebox EMCSA, as in Erotic Mind Control Story Archive, jukeboxemcsa.wordpress.com. You can find him on Tumblr at jukeboxemcsa.tumblr.com. His Patreon page, if you're interested in becoming a patron of Jukebox, is patreon.com/jukebox. And of course, you can find him on the Erotic Mind Control Story Archive at emcsa.com. That's going to do it for this episode of the Black Room Podcast. I want to thank you so much for joining me and encourage you to leave your feedback on the show, questions, comments, suggestions for future topics, for future guests, artists, authors that you'd like to see featured on the show or discussed on the show. Please let me know. You can find the official show notes for the page at podcast.callidus-mc.com. All your feedback is appreciated. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time. Until then, farewell.